Loonies, welcome back to Reformation Rambles, a series where I tell you all about the history of the European Reformation. Today we're going to discuss the founder of modern Sweden, the father of a nation, son of Cecilia Munsterter Ecker and Erik Johansson Vasa, born in Ridebeholm Castle in 1496. Let's talk about Gustav Eriksson, or Gustav Vasa. So let's set the scene. Part 1. Wives and music. So when he was born, Gustav's family had a lot of properties. They're, quite well off, We'll talk about his parents a little bit more in a moment. Throughout his life, Gustav would marry 3 times. His first wife, who he was married to from 1531 to 35, was Catherine of Saxe-Lamberg, and she would have his first son, who would go on to be Erik XIV. In 1536, everyone remarries so fast in this time. I think because having an heir in this time was kind of a numbers game. Most kids didn't survive to adulthood, so having just one is a very risky business. And particularly if you're a person of power or of wealth, you want someone to pass that on to. Otherwise there's going to be civil unrest on some level. So he remarried, this time to Margaret Lehon, Hufud. And they had 10 kids and stayed together until her death in 1551. Then in 1552 he married Catherine Steinbeck. And she would outlive him. Now these women don't come up a lot in the story I'm about to tell you, but I think it's important that you're aware that that's going on in the background of what's happening. It would be very easy to brush over the influence these people probably had on his life. And, I like some backgrounds. Sorry, kill me. Don't kill me, no. Now, Gustav was very fond of music. He's the founder of the Kungliga Kapellet, or Royal Court Orchestra. Apologies if I have any Swedish subscribers. I'm going to put all the words up on the screen because I don't trust my pronunciation. For most of the ones that aren't names, I've managed to find a sort of idea of what I should be saying, but I'm not sure if my mouth is making the noises I think it is. So, I am trying, I swear. This orchestra still exists today. It's actually one of the oldest orchestras in the world that still exists. In Gustav's lifetime, the orchestra only had 12 members. There was a woodwind section and a timpanist, but there were no strings, which just blows my mind. When I picture an orchestra, I think the first thing I put in there, in my head, are the strings. And the fact that they just weren't a thing is wild. Now, as well as his love of music, Gustav was known to have a very bad temper, and that would fuel him through. Part 2. War of Liberation. Gustav I is best known as the man who broke the Kalmar Union. This was between Sweden, Norway and Denmark, but Denmark had most of the power in this union. It wasn't equally split between the nations. So let's go back. From the end of the 14th century, Sweden was a part of the Kalmar Union. There were intermittent Swedish uprisings this entire time. All through Gustav's childhood, he would be seeing these uprisings. Throughout his childhood, various Swedish nobles kind of vied for independence and fought for it. And Gustav's father, and by extension Gustav himself, supported the nobleman Sten Sture the Younger, and he would become Swedish regent, which was how do I explain it? So, they're in the Union, and the king of the Union, who's often the Danish king, has control over all of them, but within each individual country there's a regent for that country, and that was Sten Sture from 1512, and he oversaw a war with Christian II of Denmark. This war was literally Sweden vying for independence from this union. In 1518 the Battle of Cancun took place, and the Swedish beat the Danish. After this, Sten Sture, who's running this uprising, was meant to meet Christian in Österhaninge, negotiate, and Sten Sture sent 6 men to be held as hostages to ensure the safety of King Christian in these talks. But Christian didn't turn up in Österhaninge. So one of these hostages is our boy Gustav. When Christian didn't turn up, he took the 6 hostages to Copenhagen, where they were kept in Kulla Castle. And the hostages were treated well, they just had to promise they weren't going to try and escape, and it's widely believed this was a move by King Christian to sort of make them switch sides, to make them be on his side, and like, oh, this king's actually quite nice, even though he's keeping them hostage. And it worked on 5 of the hostages. The one it didn't work on was Gustav. In 1519, Gustav escaped from Kulla Castle and fled to Lübeck. Apparently he escaped disguised as a bullocky, but eventually gave him a series of nicknames, including King Oxtail, and my personal favourite, Gustav Cowbutt, and he hated these names. I don't just mean he was mildly annoyed by them. In 1547 he actually had a man executed for raising a toast to King Gustav Cowbutt. He hated it. Christian II would eventually defeat Sten Sture in 1520. But some parts of Sweden, including like Stockholm, had held up their defences. He hadn't won everywhere, if that makes sense. After this defeat, Gustav left Lübeck on a ship and reached South Kalmar on the 31st of May 1520. He'd receive an invitation to King Christian's coronation after he captured Stockholm, like not a few months later. With a guarantee of amnesty, he wouldn't be treated poorly for having supported the losing side. Yeah, I mean, we already know this guy's not trustworthy. He was meant to go to peace talks and he captured 6 people. But a lot of people went, "Sound, there's amnesty, let's go party." Gustav didn't, and that would prove to be a very good move. There were a few days of festivities and then the castle doors were locked, with Stenstru's supporters inside. They were all accused of heresy, and around 100 people were executed. One of those executed was Gustav's father, Eric. Gustav was staying in nearby Rofsund. Side note, I have attempted to find places on maps, but some of my map pictures, if they're slightly off, I apologise. A lot of these places, either where they are has shifted or the name has changed, and because most of the information about them is in Swedish, and I'm reliant on Google Translate for things like that, I think some things might have gotten lost in translation. So if you note that any of the maps I'm putting up are incorrect, especially if they're very incorrect, feel free to let me know in the comments. Okay, he was staying in nearby Rofsund when he got the news, and so he left and he travelled to Dalarna. Then that was northwest Sweden. Now it's kind of like the middle of Sweden, I think. Supposedly he tried to gather troops from the peasants there and was pretty unsuccessful. He was then chased by men who were loyal to King Christian. And because he had no real army, he fled to Norway. So as he travelled from Mara to Lima, those who had previously rejected him changed their minds. They caught up with him and convinced him to go back with them. They'd start this army, they were down, they were absolutely down now. This all may be a myth. Gustav created a lot of propaganda about how this war went, and we think most of it isn't true now, but this is like a story etched in the history of Sweden, and whether it's true or not, it's still so widespread that it's worth mentioning, I think. Now, whether he tried to go to Norway or not, Gustav is pronounced Herbertsman, and his rebel force starts to grow. In February of 1520, around 400 men, mostly from around the Lake Siljan area. A big battle takes place at Brunberg's Ferry in the April of the same year, and the rebel army won and they sack the city of Västerås. Doing this, they gained control of the city's copper and silver mines, which gave Gustav's forces resources. This got them way more support. Now people could see they had something to offer. They were suddenly flipping over and joining this rebel army. Rebellions popped up all over Sweden, but especially in the Götaland provinces of Smarland and Västergötland. Leading nobles in Götaland joined Gustav's forces. and they declared Gustav regent of Sweden in 1520. And then there's a lot of switching sides. Some noblemen would remain loyal to King Christian, and most of those actually left Sweden. A lot of the ones that remained were actually killed, so leaving was a very good shout. As a result, the Swedish Privy Council lost some of its old members, and they were all replaced by Gustav's supporters. At this point, most cities and castles are run by Gustav's supporters, but some, including Stockholm, were now just under Danish control. I love that Stockholm seems to be the strong fort regardless of which side they're on. So in 1522, Gustav started negotiating with the city of Lübeck, who eventually agreed to join the war against Denmark. And they helped the rebels out. They gave them loans, they gave them warships. In 1523, these combined forces attacked the Danish and Norwegian areas in Scania, Holland, Blekinge, and Bohuslän. In this time, Christian II was actually overthrown and replaced by Frederick I. Now, he claimed the Swedish throne when he came to power, and he kind of hoped that this power move would make Lübeck switch sides and support him as ruler of Sweden. You may have been wondering anyway, why were Lübeck helping? This isn't their war. Lübeck wanted Sweden to be independent of the Kalmar Union, but with Frederick wanting them on his side, they realised they had quite a strong hand to play. So they put pressure on the rebels to guarantee Lübeck privileges on future trade and a guarantee of repayments of the loans they had given them to fight this war. And they knew this support was essential, so Gustav agreed. And with that support, Gustav was made regent of Sweden, fully ignoring Frederick's claim to this position. In 1523, leading Swedes got together in Strängnäs to decide on Gustav being king of Sweden. Then they met some councillors from Lübeck who supported this appointment. They actually declared it an act of God, and soon Gustav announced his acceptance of the position to the Privy Council. There's a ceremony led by the Deacon of Strängnäs, who was Laurentius André. Gustav swore the royal oath, and the next day Laurentius rose the Holy Sacrament above a kneeling Gustav in front of a load of bishops and priests. He was officially crowned on the 6th of June, and that is now known as National Day of Sweden. Shortly after this, he would enter Stockholm and put himself in the Trädgården Palace. Even after he was crowned, bailiffs were still holding castles in modern-day Finland, but that was Sweden at the time. But all of these castles would surrender by late 1523. In 1524, Gustav arrived in Malmö to reach a settlement with Denmark and Norway. The resultant Treaty of Malmö acknowledged Swedish independence, sort of prohibited them from expanding and taking more land because these were the lines that were drawn of borders. Sweden was no longer under the Kalmar Union, and this ended the Swedish War of Liberation. Gustav had won. 3. Uprisings. As a ruler, Gustav had a ruthless streak, and he brutally suppressed any and all future uprisings. The province of Dalarna had 3 separate uprisings in the first 10 years of his reign. The people revolting thought he'd been too harsh to Danish supporters, also resented the way he'd moved to Protestantism. We'll get to that in a moment. Many of his own supporters joined these rebellions and were executed as a result. There was also a peasants' revolt in Smarland in 1542. This was down to a mix of reasons. There were grievances over taxes, church reform, confiscation of church bells, church vestments. This uprising took place in dense woodland, which made managing it very difficult. Gustav would eventually request support from every Swedish province, as well as paying German mercenaries for their support, and he would successfully end the rebellion in 1543. The rebellion was led by Nils Thacker. These days he's kind of viewed as a traitor to Sweden, so this is down to extensive propaganda. Nils' letters to rebels focused on the things I mentioned before. Suppression of Catholic beliefs, suppression of Catholic custom, and just being disenchanted with Gustav's very autocratic rule. Apparently Nils was badly wounded, had wounds in both legs that were quite severe. But a lot of historians think that didn't happen because it was the 16th century and he would have just died of sepsis. He was definitely killed for the uprising, but we don't know how. He was either quartered or, whilst trying to escape the woods as an outlaw, he was shot. Either way, his head was mounted on a pole at Kalmar as a warning to others that this is what would happen if you tried to make things better for the peasants. Sometimes never change. Overall, Gustav was the first autocratic sovereign. He was a skilled bureaucrat and propagandist, as we've already mentioned. He spread these tales about his liberation struggle, and regardless of how true they are, they're still told today. In 1544, Gustav had Sweden's elective monarchy abolished, replaced by a hereditary monarchy, so his children would take the throne, like how the English one works now. No, I don't know why we still have a monarchy, but we do. And that's how it would remain until 1654. I'm not exaggerating, like, he was an autocrat. But he did change a lot about how the country was run beyond that. So part 4, reform. One key thing he did was centralise the Swedish government. Replaced local landowners, noblemen, and clergy with central governors, bishops. Replaced sheriffs with bailiffs and governors who were loyal to him. He also reformed administration, particularly financial administration, the establishment of the chamber, expanded and reorganised the chancellery. He raised taxes, mainly to repay the enormous loans he'd taken out from Lubeck. But this is Reformation Rambles, so let's talk about how he reformed the church. Part 5. Church reform. When Gustav took the throne, the previous archbishop was exiled because he had supported King Christian II. Gustav asks the Pope Clement VII, if he'll accept the guy that he's putting forward as archbishop. And he said no. Pope Clement VII loved saying no. We talked about him in my Henry VIII video. This new guy was called Johannes Magnus, and the Pope said he couldn't be archbishop because Gustav had no right exiling the previous archbishop, and actually he was still archbishop and he needed to get him to come back. So he sends him a message like, make the old guy come back. And Gustav has to reply like, I can't. He's on the side of the king who isn't king here anymore. He's not going to come back. He doesn't want to. And the Pope, like every shit manager ever, goes, okay, just do it. A direct quote, but that's the gist. Not only did the Pope not allow Gustav's nominated archbishop, but there were 4 bishop seats free at the time, and of all of the people that Gustav suggested, only 1 was appointed by the Pope. Around this time, the king was already being influenced by a scholar called Olaus Petri, who, frankly, I should make a whole video on. In 1531, Gustav would snap after arguing back and forth with the Pope for ages and appoint Olaus' brother, Laurentius Petri, as archbishop through a royal order. And just like that, the Pope lost all control over the Swedish church. This wasn't as out of blue as it seems. As far back as the 1520s, the Petris had been introducing Lutheran ideas to Sweden. Olaus was a consecrated priest and still got married. He'd also published a series of texts defending Lutheran ideas. In 1526, a New Testament translated into Swedish was published. Around 1540 to 41, a full translated Bible would be produced. It was called the Gustav Vasa Bible, but because no one in Sweden spoke the original ancient Greek, it wasn't taken from the original text, it was taken from Martin Luther's translation of the original text from 1536. You're like, we know German, we'll go with that one. But in 1527 at Riksdag in Västerås, Gustav had implemented reduced church property and officially made himself head of the church. By 1540 he'd implement tougher church policy, and the Swedish church would be forced to move from lots of relatively independent churches, full-on state-controlled religion. And just like that, Gustav Vasa had cut all ties to Rome and established the Lutheran Church of Sweden. Part 6. Legacy. Gustav gave his last speech in 1560 to the chancellors, his children and noblemen, where he encouraged them to remain united. He was buried with all 3 of his wives, although for some reason only 2 of them are on the plaque in the Cathedral of Uppsala. His health had been in decline since the late 1550s, and when his grave was opened in the 20th century, still don't entirely understand why it was opened, but I digress. It was found he'd had chronic infections in the leg and in the jaw. To this day he's seen as one of Sweden's greatest kings, ending foreign control in Sweden. There's a lot of 19th century folklore about Gustav's adventures liberating the country. Most of it's based on his own propaganda, and it's almost all not true. But the stories are still told across Sweden. He's remembered in many ways. He's remembered in embroidered history books, in commemorative coins, an annual ski event in Vasalopol, which is based on his trip halfway to Norway and back. The city of Vasa in Finland is named after his family. It was named in 1606, and his face was on the 1,000 krona note until 2016. And that's the story of Gustav Vasa. I really hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please give me a cheeky like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if I touched on anything you'd like to hear more about. I really enjoy making this, as I always say, and the fact that anyone watches it just brings me such joy, so thank you. And I'll see you guys later. Bye!